afternoon, maybe evening. My name is Faizan Gawani, and I will be your moderator today. Our panel's theme, which I find warming and lovely, is cultivating our beauty. We'll be discussing the mental health and belonging of diverse sexualities and gender identities within the particularly migrant South Asian community. And we have two wonderful panelists here with us, so allow me to introduce them. We have first with us Aruna Rao. She is a proud mother of a queer and transgender young adult and a mental health advocate. She is a steering committee member of API Rainbow Parents of PFLAG in New York City, as well as the founder of Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies, which is making waves right now and really expanding, an organization developed to support South Asian parents of LGBTQ plus children. Until recently, she was also the Associate Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, of New Jersey. Our second panelist is Rahim Pavar, and he joins us from Canada. He's a registered social worker in Ontario, Canada, as well as a national core organizing team member of Salam Canada, an LGBTQ Muslim organization, and a co-editor of a local history anthology entitled Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer. He operates from a harm reduction, sex positive, anti-oppressive, and trauma-informed approach, providing psychotherapy to newcomer, racialized, queer, trans, and HIV-affected communities. We have, lastly, myself, right, the moderator. I personally am really passionate about intergenerational healing, queer and trans visibility in Muslim spaces, and sex positivity. I'm currently pursuing my MBA from UC Berkeley and focusing on ethical artificial intelligence. And I also enjoy facilitating a lot of discussions on gender and sexuality, as well as elderly marginalization in the Shia Ismaili Muslim community. So once again, welcome. Now that you know a little bit about us, please know that we'd also love to hear your questions. And the intimacy of the group is such that you can please post your chats and questions and commentary into the chat box. And we have at least 20 minutes at the end to address as many questions as we can. With that, I'm gonna begin our questions. Anyone would like to add anything before I jump in?
You're good.
Awesome. Okay, so Rahim and Aruna, when we chatted to really further bring out some of the questions that we wanted to address, we thought about creating a foundation first that everyone could meet us at. And one of that is, what's the state of our families today? So there may be a South Asian mental health archetype we can dig into here. So one of the things that we find is the interconnectedness of the health of our population. So not only the health and well-being of us LGBTQ folks, but also of our families and the environments we're situated in. So for starters, I'd like to first go to Aruna. So what mental health challenges do you see in your work and in the people you serve or work alongside, both queer and trans South Asians, as well as their family units?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Faizan, and lovely to be here today with all of you. Actually, the bulk of people who we see in Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies spaces are LGBTQ folk. I don't think it'll surprise everybody to say that there are fewer parents and family members and a lot more LGBTQ folk. Most are in the 18 to 30 age range, and most are there in our space because they're confronting barriers either coming out to their families, or once they're out, their identities are neither accepted nor valued or validated by their families. And so there's a lot of distress. There's distress, mostly the breaking of family relationships. Some are pushed to, straining points. There's a lot of anger and hostility and silencing that they're facing from their families. And they feel they're responsible for their parents' grief. So I think that's what I see mostly with the queer and trans folk that are coming into these spaces. And then sadly enough, most are kind of reconciled to living in the margins. They've decided that, if their engagement with family has to be conditional on being silenced, so be it. So they're willing to be silenced just so that they can be part of this family space. And I'm thinking of, like, for instance, someone I've talked to recently who's in the situation where he has not married his partner for 3 years in the hope that his parents will come around. And instead, his parents have just announced the engagement of his younger cis straight brother, and not invited him to it. So it kind of like, these are the spaces that people are experiencing so much rejection from. On the other side of the equation, when you're talking about parents and allied family members, siblings, or grandparents, I think one of the things we talked about when we were discussing this panel is that many of us, and I count myself amongst this group, cis straight parents and allies, are sort of like trapped in a frozen in time, sort of like almost like in a little bubble. And we immigrated, some of us in the 70s, sometimes in the 80s, sometimes the early 2000s. And we carry the norms of that time and date and space with us. So we feel that when our kids come out, it's a betrayal of everything that we value or consider right. Whereas, when I look at similar, kinds of people of my age in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, there's a little bit of progression because things are not frozen. There's, for instance, pride parades in little towns now that I see, in the media. And I see the fact that almost all three of the major South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, have actually sort of, what would you call it? Legalized trans identities by offering this third gender identity. So there's like progress that's happening in South Asia that we don't see in our immigrant communities. And so a lot of grief, loss, mourning that the families are dealing with. And of course, in the context of all of this, the model minority myth doesn't help. We are all aspiring that we ourselves and our children also have to fit into this myth. And also the fear of community. Log kya kahenge? What will people say? What will people say about me, about my child? And then lastly, I'm just kind of like, thinking about all the things I can cram in here. And lastly, the main thing I see in a lot of older folks and, basically anybody middle-aged and over is somatizing things, which are, essentially there's parents who have dizzy spells and palpitations and things like that. And that's kind of like essentially like part of the arsenal that's used against the LGBTQ identified person to sort of bring them in line. So that in a nutshell is what I'm saying.
I love that so much. The last thing you said, I couldn't help but smile, even though, the person who's saying, if you come out, if you tell people, like, what's going to happen to me, your mother, I'm going to have a heart attack, or I smile because I know that that's a serious thing for a person who's thinking, I'm at my breaking point. I don't think I can take another thing. Like, this is too big for me. But also, I like that you use the word arsenal because it's a kind of emotional abuse,
It is. Mm-hmm.
In my family, like I've heard people have said similar things, and I'm a bit of a smartass. So I've retorted with things like, well, you're an adult and you're gonna have to take care of your own health. Like, I can't do anything about that. Watch what you eat, take lots of walks, and tolerate some distress. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And I think, the guilt that LGBTQ people carry is huge. And I know that we see that in mainstream society too, but I think in South Asian communities in particular, it's a lot, and to be fair, there's a strain, I think, on both generations. We've come from places where we have these models of taking care of our elders, and elders expecting us not only to take care of them, but in exchange, they give us something, like they hand off a name, a property, a progeny, perhaps a house. Oh, sorry, I said property. And that, a lot of that gets disrupted, because what we're talking about is not just who I love and who I'm attracted to. What we're talking about is, like, as a result of who I'm attracted to, how do I come to see the world in a completely different way? And it's making me sexuality and the experience of like the experience of just gender, having your gender policed, puts you in a marginalized place where you then, for a lot of people anyway, question so many things, right? So when people are, wonder, for me, like, they're like, what is your relationship with Islam, and what made you want to question it or challenge it? And I would say, this isn't true for everybody, but for me, it was my sexuality. And what that means is it's not about whether or not same-sex sexuality is allowed in Islam, but it's about being on the margins and not seeing yourself fit in, and then starting to reimagine, well, where do I fit in? What is my life going to be like? What if I do experience abandonment? What if I get the ultimate rejection and I'm disowned, right? So Faizan, to answer your question, about what mental health challenges do we see in the people we work with, for me, the thing that's a bit disheartening is that even with many generations in Toronto, where I'm from, of queer South Asian activism, there's still a generation that's older than me that'll say things like, give us time. This is new to us. We're just adjusting. We didn't have all of this when we were growing up. And I'm empathetic for like 30 seconds. And then I think, no, I know queer and trans people that are your age, they're my parents' age. So if you grew up in a place and you didn't know any queer or trans people, it's probably because you stayed away from them, you were afraid of them, you thought of them as the other, you relegated them to the margins of society, or, you were woven into a family unit or community that shunned people, so you didn't have access to those people, right? So I don't buy this, the queerness as being generational. I don't think that's a fair argument. The other thing I think I see is, with the patterns of immigration, a lot of us have bought into the American dream, which I think it's similar in Canada as it is in the States. And so I know a lot of my family, moved to the city when they moved to Canada, and then when they moved to Toronto in particular. And what was desirable was to live in a house in the suburbs. And as lovely as it is that those dreams were achieved, I would argue that staying in a city gives you access to more people with different kinds of ideas and livelihoods that cross over. It doesn't mean there isn't ignorance. It doesn't mean there isn't any othering, but there's like an opportunity for exposure. The suburban life, I think, has created, it's represents a marker of progress and success for a lot of people, to have a home and kids and a dog and a fence and a barbecue. People love barbecuing. But, if you have to get in your car to go everywhere, then you're in your big home. And if you want some fresh air, you just go to your backyard. And then if you need to go out, you use your car and you go to places where you meet other people like you, right? Both at work or where your place of worship. And the intersecting of communities, I think, gets lost. And as much as I see South Asian community building and culture as a strength, I also see it as a limitation, something that can be extremely constraining, suffocating. It can cause a lot of fear for folks. Maybe I will leave it there for this question anyway.
Thank you both. I think you've given us a lot of a foundation to work with, as well as a lot of kind of interloping ideas here. I think a few things that I've heard so far is, okay, there's a lot of guilt, definitely. Yes. And I would think there's guilt on all sides, the parents as well. I think there's a lot of self-shaming, or that comes out as anger, a lot of sense of crestfallenness. And then on the side of the LGBTQ person as well, I've heard from Aruna, you said there's almost an acquiescing to the silence thing, because we want to stay in those communities. We don't want to lose that cultural attachment we have, especially growing up in a different kind of environment in this country or that country. And so there's a sense of loss, there's a lot of grief and anger, and saving face as well in the middle of a lot of assimilation and this trauma. Thank you. Someone shared in the chat, immigrant time warp, I believe. Thank you for sharing that phrasing. I think it's nice to know that it's also coined. So now that we have a kind of lay of the land of where we stand briefly, could you both share more about what existing support systems look like right now in navigating a lot of these stressors for both the LGBTQ community as well as their family units, and kind of how they fare? And I'll start off with Rahim on this one. think,
Okay,
and
sure.
then move on to Aruna.
Sure. I think one of the things that's been really promising from my perspective has been seeing a lot of LGBTQ people willing to access public services, like access psychotherapy. And part of it might be generational, like, psychotherapy is cool in our generation. But I think the willingness and desire to build community is very strong. And I think we've learned that from our South Asian ancestors. And so we go to look to recreate that somewhere else in a place that feels safer. So that's a nod to, all the South Asian queer people that have built their own communities, have built their own events, and their own community spaces, like I see queer iftars and queer Diwali parties and things like that. And that's really lovely, right? However, you know, mainstream mental health supports and mainstream healthcare in general, of which I include both primary and mental health care, possibly even sexual health, it's very white. Even when people try to do cultural competence, there's a lot of anxiety, right? If it wasn't white, then for a very first time, a South Asian person going to, an STI HIV testing clinic wouldn't be so anxious, wouldn't feel so out of place. It really feels like you're in another world and you're living in a parallel universe to the family, community, home life. And to me, there's a gap there. I feel like our communities are willing to have us, but they don't want to talk about like things that are important to us, like sex and sexuality. And it's kind of a big deal. It's a big part of who we are. So I think there's a gap there, in the whiteness of services and the lack of cultural competency. And I think it's hard to be culturally competent because we might just need to wait so that we have more South Asian providers, right? And the vibe of our countries shift a little bit where services are provided. Now I think for, parents, allies. Now, I do want to say that, there's lots of folks who are parents to kids and they're coming out at a different stage in their life. And those aren't folks I'm referring to when I say this, but lots of folks who have kids that are LGBTQ, they feel a lot of shame about accessing services. I've spoken to so many South Asian folks who I'm like, do your parents want to talk to somebody? Do they want to get support? Do they want to process their grief? Do they want to meet other people with queer and trans kids? And over, the answer is like, no, absolutely not. Don't tell anybody. We're going to figure this out on our own. And it's fine for someone to make a choice about what services they want to receive and not receive. But saying, no, we don't want to share this with anybody, signals a message that the thing we're talking about is embarrassing, or it's disgusting, or it doesn't fit in how we see progress or how we see evolution at all. And that's disheartening because the queer person, the trans person in the family internalizes that. I've seen some folks who work quite well in their family units, and maybe it's taken 5 years, 10 years, but like the acceptance is there. They go to family dinners, their queer partners are invited to things. But if you were to ask them to be on a panel, they might still be quite hesitant. And to me, it says something else about their own fear. Now, don't get me wrong. As a queer person, I know I have to manage my expectations for maybe how the people in my life can show up for me. But my point is that even with services available, I think there's a lot of folks who struggle with shame and disclosure, and not trusting what will happen with information they share. And so there's a lot of work to be done. We're talking about like systemic, ideological, evolutionary work about who we are, what our purpose is in the world, what's the purpose of having kids, what's the purpose of educating them, procreating, like I think my family paid a lot of money to have me educated so that I could get married and have kids. I think they envisioned access to opportunity in a particular way, but I got really educated and questioned everything and carved out a beautiful life for myself. But it's one that they can't relate to. And that's challenging. I think that experience is I think it's replicated. It resonates with a lot of folks.
Yeah, no, Rahim, thank you for saying that. And this is something that, as much as I try to kind of like think of myself as the cool auntie and the cool mom, I find myself trapped into some of this own thinking, right? So my kid is queer and trans, and has had a very expensive education, which we were glad to give him, and and in many ways, he is making great use of it. I mean, he's trying to figure out who he is and how he wants to live and what he wants to be in the world. And there's this like little bit of, there's a lot of pride. I'm really proud of him. But there's also a little bit of a sinking feeling knowing that, this kind of model of aspiration where the child is going to be even more, and I'm going to use the word assimilated, really, assimilated and like part of this country in a way that kind of is quote unquote successful, is not really like going to be our dream, because we cannot have that dream for ourselves, we cannot have that dream for our kid. And even though I know rationally that that's all great, there's still a little bit of like, especially when I'm like in the auntie crowd and there's a little bit of like jostling and shoving about like, hey, look at my kid. That is where parents, I think, face that piece where there is no community support, there is zero community support. And speaking of like access to care, so at least there is, as you said, there is an affirming set of therapists, mostly white, but like increasingly more and more people of color who are available for the LGBTQ community. Frequently, most parents want to see South Asian therapists if they at all agree to go see someone. And I am so reluctant to refer families to South Asian therapists, because I have been burned by the fact that a lot of South Asian therapists carry the same bias and same misinformation that the parents themselves carry. And most will not actually admit their, the lack of information, the lack of education. They're willing to kind of like coast in a sort of like, yes, yes, I understand and I support, but really they don't. And this extends across, like, it's not just mental health. I mean, too frequently I hear of primary care doctors, basically pediatricians, who will tell the kid that who will tell the parents that their kid expressing any kind of gender diversity is wrong and should be nipped in the bud. And it's a phase that'll kind of, they'll grow out of. So there is like a real lack of resources for parents. And even if they are seen as by somebody who is affirming of LGBTQ identities, who has the correct information, their ethnicity, their immigration process, that whole status is just not addressed. So only part of them is going to be seen. And I've heard that also actually from a lot of LGBTQ folks themselves. It's like, you can find LGBTQ affirming care, but what about the rest of me? And when you think of things like, for instance, religious identity, or having to explain your strange connection to your parents as an adult, where you are like really sort of, just you're calling your mom every day when you're 30 years old. So those are the kinds of things that, like, have to be explained in
Aruna, we could
context.
have a session about boundaries. I
Yes,
can help you through that.
hey, I'm like way beyond 13. I still call my 83-year-old mom every day. So it happens, and it's something that we are living with. But yeah, no, I just wanted to say this very little. One thing actually I wanted to say that's really encouraging, which I've seen lately. The oldest South Asian organizations in North America are DV organizations. They arose out of the need for, domestic violence services and back 30, 40 years back, some of them. And some of them are stepping up, not all of them, but some are stepping up to now sort of start thinking, if they're offering services to the community at large, why aren't they serving LGBTQ folk? And particularly now during the pandemic, they're thinking of the fact that there's a lot of young LGBTQ folk, particularly TGNC people, who are really sort of, trapped in abusive situations. They have to come back home, and home is not in any way affirming of who they are, and can actually deny them life affirming care. Can deny them access to hormones or surgery or any kind of affirming medical care. So I think the DV organizations are beginning to realize this and are trying to step up to understanding how to serve this community. So I see that as a real point of hope here.
I just want to add something to that. That is, well, I forgot what it was that I wanted to add to that. Um, oh, yes, that, heterosexuality as a system is quite toxic. When you talked about other parents talking about their kids, this is about how do we participate in our world, we talk about this idea of culture as amorphous and it's fluid, it changes, but it's something we're connected to. But like, how do we participate in it? And part of how we've learned to participate is to humble brag, and talk about shared markers of progress, right? So like, it's like, oh, my son's a dentist, or my daughter's becoming a lawyer, or, it's, or if there's a hint of misogyny, my daughter's marrying a lawyer. These are all things to be really proud of because they're seen as upward mobility. And I think when you've come from a place of maybe not having a lot or having a history of migration, of course, upward mobility is part of the plan, right? But I think where we get stuck is the toxicity of heterosexuality because it's a system that doesn't allow other people to participate. So if my gender varies, if my relationships look different, if I have creative ideas that, stray away from making me a desirable, a desirable person, both to bring in an income or to be wedded to somebody else, what is my worth? And I think in our communities I think we really have to expand our imagination about what our worth is. Excuse me, outside of following a very narrow trajectory. We need to open it up. Like we really I really think our community is having a crisis of imagination at times, and we really need to challenge that. So yeah.
And these are conversations we need to have with our kids. I mean, it's one thing for us to have sort of, decided that this is our progress, but it's another thing to talk to your kids about what does success mean, right? And that's a question we never have that. It's like, we define what success is. So yeah, I think there's plenty to be done in this space.
I love hearing you two converse because one, there's so many gems of phrases, and I see our audience picking them up. Crisis of imagination, heterosexuality as a system is toxic, and there's I'm hearing this desire of freedom, right? Whose freedom are we living, and whose freedom do we want to live? Have we even thought about what that means for us individually and community-wise and collectively? I remember asking my mom like last year, did you want to have kids or was it just a thing to do? And she has 2 kids. They're both queer. They're both trans. It's kind of ridiculous for her. And she's like, it was it was the thing you did. Got married. 9 months later, I popped out. Basically, there was a timing. I mapped it out, and it. And she can admit that to me now, I'm in my 30s, she feels okay. However, the fact that even her as a probably heterosexual woman hasn't didn't have a chance to think about it, wasn't able to question it or have the support system to question something like that. And so how are we raising all of our individuals versus X or Y or Z?
Faizan, I just want to jump in. You talked about your mom not having like this opportunity to question things, and there's this film. It's on YouTube now, but it was made in the early 2000s. It's called Rewriting the Script, a love letter to our South Asian families, and it's quite beautiful. It's family members talking about their experiences and what it was like to have queer and trans people come out to them. Anyway, it just popped into my mind when you talked about like your mom had a script, and I think we need to rewrite that script, even though it's 20 years after the documentary, we still need to rewrite it.
We do. And also hearing the healthcare providers, right? A lot of our folks may want to go to South Asian therapists. Do we even have enough of those in our community? Are we even encouraging folks to enter the industries that we need most support in internally? And so there's a lot of that representation wise. So moving on. So can you tell us a little bit about your own work? So, how do whether it's activism, organizations, social work, how does that feed into supporting our communities? And if we could start with Aruna, and then we'll move on to Rahim. Thank you.
Sure. So my work for at least the last almost 3 to 4 years now has really been focused on, what can I do to support families so we don't get to this space where there is so much grief and trauma. So what can you do to kind of like get families to where they need to be so that families can remain whole and remain connected? And that came out of my own experience of isolation and being someone who thought of themselves as being able to handle things and not really understanding how to handle my own emotions, my own grief, my own process when my kid came out. So a lot of what we see, so this is an organization, for those of you who don't know, called Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies. We're now officially a nonprofit organization, incorporated last year, but for many years it was my passion project, where it really was about building support systems. And a lot of this work has come out of my own experience as working with NAMI, where peer support, the therapeutic value of peer support is really, foregrounded. So what I focus on is offering support to people at the stage of acceptance that they're in. So rather than this kind of educational focus where you give them information and you tell them like what needs to be done, you meet them where they are at that stage and give them the support to get to where they need to go. But you can't tell them. I mean, the whole advice giving thing is like just such a nightmare. So we try not to go there at all. And really what I see is community support. It's about peer support is profoundly healing. To just not feel isolated, to feel that you are part of a community, and this community may even look like you, may talk like you, may have the similar backgrounds. It just ends your isolation. It ends this feeling of like, you're the only person in this room, you're silenced, you're shunned, there's nowhere to go. So we're running support groups now at this, for separately for LGBTQ folk who need support, separately for parents and uncles and aunts and grandparents who may need support to get where they want to go. And really, I think what we're like mostly talking about within these groups is the idea that the child is not confused. So most people come to this with like, my child is confused, my child is in bad company, my child is learning things from friends, and the child is as I said, could be 30 years old, but it's still the sense of like outside circumstances are causing this terrible thing to happen. And so we really focus on, this is not necessarily chosen, and if it is chosen, it's essentially like something that should be within the like general spectrum of things that are chosen in life. And it's not an idea that came out of nowhere. So I think that's really the reinforcing thing that we really start addressing most of the time. And I do try to like refer people to mental health resources, but as I mentioned, it's just like really hard to find resources that are really appropriate for the families that we're dealing with. And I think that's really like where a lot of this needs to go. I know that Rahim is part of affirming provider groups, and I think there need to be more groups like that that come up and sort of start talking about what is it that families need. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here today, because I feel like this kind of community is where providers can start thinking about these issues and addressing them, and understanding what families like mine really need in order to move beyond the sense of just shame, guilt, grief. So that's where I'm coming from.
Mm. Thanks for that, Aruna. My work looks a little bit different than yours. For the last 5 to 6 years, I worked at a health center, and now I'm fully in private practice. And at the health center, I was on a health team working with LGBTQ folks, and a number of people I saw, there were South Asian people who were born in Canada, but also a number of people that were newcomers, and a small portion of them who were also asylum seekers. Now, the asylum seekers most of them weren't South Asian. Um, um, but all the same, in terms of my work, I've seen some of the difficulties people have in their homes, whether they're here or in their communities of origin in another place in the world. And what's always really sad for me to see is just that a lot of people have hopes that they're going to come to Canada, they're going to come to the US, and things are going to be better. And frankly, I've had people who came from, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, went to the US, hated it, came to Canada, still hate it. And I think there's this idea of utopia and what, like, it lets me know, that people are seeking something. They have in their imagination, there is something that's bigger and better and inclusive. And then it's unfortunate that, they don't find it. Or for the first time, they experience what it's like to be a racial minority in a place, right? That's not necessarily when you're part of a majority dominant group, you don't always think about the color of your skin and what the implications are. You don't always think about your accent and what that means. I think for both of our countries on this part of the world, we're really I think we put a lot of weight on how somebody speaks, whereas in other places in the world, being able to communicate a complex idea is great on its own, regardless of the accent. In our parts of the world, we're I don't know what the word is. Well, no, I know the word. The word is racist. And so, for me, I think as a therapist, a lot of my work is about creating a safe space for someone and for people to process who they are, what they want, and give them a space to do a lot of the grief work. People will talk about their parents dying before they could come out. People just really coming to terms with the fact that they won't ever come out. We joked about it before where we're like, okay, there's these ailments. I'm going to give my mom a heart attack. But in truth, I could challenge somebody a little bit. But if that's the path they're going to take, they're like, you know what? I don't need to come out. I want to also embrace that. I want to support that. I think coming out is also, it can be critiqued as a very white notion. And I think we can perhaps express our identities in different ways. So I want to create space for that. Even though that didn't work for me, being explicit about who I am and declaring it boldly was important. For other people, that's obnoxious. So I just want to give them, that space to make those decisions. I also think, when you Aruna, when you were answering the previous conversation, you were talking about how you feel like you might be losing somebody as they get more assimilated and they get more distant from where you've come from. And I think the coming out process for a lot of racialized queer people, I think we also experience that. I think we're also afraid that I'm going to abandon my culture. I'm going to be like usurped and like integrated into this other thing. And then what? Right? Because when you come out, you're coming out into another community that has a lot of its own norms, right? And you can resist some of them, but like they're also very real and you might find value in them. So, there is a celebration of sex and bodies and different relationship models. There's also resistance to heteronormative systems. And not everybody falls into the same camp, right? Not everyone's going to say, I don't want to get married. That's a straight thing. That's not the point. The point is that that idea exists in a queer subculture and the person coming out gets exposed to that, right? So we're thinking about multiple messages, multiple ways of being that are coming together. And I see people struggling with those tensions because they're antithetical sometimes, they're diametrically opposed, and other times they fit quite well. It depends on who you're talking to. Another piece of work I do is, and I've been doing this for about a decade, is community organizing with an organization called Salam Canada. We'll be launching a new website for those of you who want to check us out. It's just salamcanada.info. And our goal is to carve out spaces for LGBTQ Muslims in whatever shape that takes across the country. And what I'm seeing in that community is, people ranging from looking for theological explanations of who they are or theological forms of validation, We all want to see ourselves mirrored somewhere, but for some people, being on a documentary or a movie or in an ad is enough, where somebody else will say, no, I want to see myself reflected in a religious text, or I want it to come from a place of authority, right? Now, of course, I think we need to deconstruct authority, but that's beside the point. And so, there are affirming resources out there, but they're hard to access and they're not easy to access. And people will say they want something theological or something authoritative, but it's a whole other skill set to read and decipher some of those texts. I've sent so many people to these books about rethinking Islam from an LGBTQ perspective, or Amina Wadud's work, rethinking Islam from a feminist perspective. Like it's dense. It's not like it's hard for it's not easily accessible for the average person. And so that's a challenge. And sometimes I wonder if looking for acceptance or affirmation, from a particular kind of authority, like, like a priest, a pundit, an imam, whatever it is, if it's a bit fraught, like if we set ourselves up for failure, and so sometimes I'm telling people, like, are you sure you want to go to this person? Like, what do you think they're going to say? And like, we maybe need to break the cycle of you going to places to look for love and then feeling abandoned or feeling rejected, right? And there might be more power in you saying, you know what? I'm not going to ask this person because what they say is not going to be helpful. And that's the growth. That's the process, the work. So it talks a lot about the work, the mental health pieces. And I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on something you said, Rahim, about the whole, this sense of like looking for love and like seeking like love in sort of this higher power or spiritual places, and so it's been kind of like a battle for me. Initially, my thought was these spaces should be recreated and be sort of queer and trans centered. Like it shouldn't be just like you're part of like other spaces that allow you to be part of them. It should be that LGBTQ identities are the celebratory centered aspect of all these kind of spiritual religious events or celebrations or activities or whatever. And then I started thinking that's all predicated on you being an adult capable of like seeking your own path, right? It's all about like you have to like kind of like then come to this period where you can grow into this person who can seek all these opportunities for yourself.
Yes.
And it all comes back to what about children? What about children who are growing up in these spaces, and you have to like first learn these messages that you are wrong, essentially, that you're
Yeah.
completely wrong, and then you have to unlearn them and then come to the place where you'll relearn again that you are right. So it's so I think this work has to be done in our faith spaces. I don't see a choice in it. I see it being essential. And if you can kind of like change a child's experience, you can transform the experience of queer and trans people for the next generation.
I've had several elders in the community who've approached me and said, Raheem, I have this important meeting with this person who is part of the community and they make decisions and I have a chance. What should I say? and they're very sweet and I'm very honored that they're calling me. I'm like, this is an uncle. Like, like I don't know what to tell them. But I've found myself saying, you know what? Take a step back and you don't have to leap into LGBTQ acceptance. First, we need to talk about gender and we need to talk about women and we need to talk about misogyny and differential roles. Like there's some ground level work of like what, academically we would talk about as challenging, like cis sexism and heterosexism, like analyze the whole system and see how does gender play into it and how do we segregate things and how are the roles we assign to people harmful or limiting. Like that's where we need to begin, because otherwise if we keep the baseline the same and then we just try to haphazardly add other people in, I think they're gonna get hurt, or it's gonna be like it's like a big party where you have to be disassociated to attend. How is that different from a dance club on drugs, I mean, both can be good, but like, it's nice to also be present. So, and I think I've heard so many people say, oh, I'm going to go see my family this week and we're going to a wedding. And weddings are beautiful. They're also sites of such pain for so many of us, not because legally we can't do it, but because in our communities, it will likely never look the same as it does for straight people, right? No matter what, whether we have the option or not, there's a grief, there's a thing that we have to resolve. And that's because even if someone made an exception, there's some groundwork that hasn't been done and has yet to be done.
All right. So we all know that we at some point need another day where we could listen to Arun and Rick talk, I think. There was a lot there. And in terms of not only how your individual work feeds into the healing and the mental health support of our communities, but also how each of us kind of, I think what I'm hearing a lot of is the power, distribution of power, access of power within communities. And when we say we are, sometimes language is a really important starting point. For example, in my community, if I had even heard the word gay a little more growing up in a positive light, or found South Asian language terms that were positive and not negative connotated, maybe I would have felt a little more comfortable about it growing up. There are certain like access points, if we're allowed into the conversation, there's less fear. And that having a conversation with words that we can use for visibility, as well as gender, there's power in the community. Who holds power? Why are gender roles in the household the way they are? And if we're not addressing those, how will we be able to address LGBTQ and all of its alphabet as well, and the varying levels of identities that we actually embrace, whereas others might suppress. So there's a lot. But Raheem brought up the word utopia, and we wanted to go there next. So thinking a bit about what is your long-term vision for our communities? What does a utopia look like when you imagine and dream? And I'm going to start with Raheem on this one.
Oh, it's such a hard question. It's laden with excitement, grief, anger, sadness, because there was a time where I would say, I want to be able to go to my Jamaat Khana where we would go to pray with my partner. And then after services, if it was a special occasion, a lot of us are Gujarati heritage, and, we want to be able to do Garba and Dandiya. And wouldn't that be so great? But even though that could be possible now, it's tricky because I don't really want it. I'm not so interested in that. I've seen a lot of people say, hey, let's, as a bunch of queer people, go to this prayer space and we'll be together and it'll be nice. And like, that is a utopia. I think that's great. I think taking up space is great. Something has just shifted in me where I'm just not so interested anymore. People will say, oh, within our community space, it would be so nice if a same gender couple could be lead prayer, be ministers, do this, do that. And like, part of me thinks yes, that's great. I want that for you, but I just don't have a desire for it anymore. And I feel lost around that because I feel like there was an energy in me that was really excited to create change from within a system. And then I kind of abandoned the system. And I don't want to go back. And that's also hard because I'm like, oh, if I kept that fire, maybe I could have done something different with it. So that's hard for me sometimes. I think, when I see a lot of queer Muslim people who is a lot, which is what I come across with Salam Canada, I often think, regardless of what my relationship with religion and God is, what we need as people in this part of the world, especially, is a space to not have to be defensive about any part of our identities. So a utopia would be, being allowed to just explore our identities and be who we are. So if I want to pick and choose what it means to be Muslim, fine. If I want to wear makeup and a dress, fine. Let our creativity be honored and celebrated, as opposed to seen as deviant or attention seeking. That would be a utopia. I think change within systems is important, but it starts like it's not just the community, this amorphous it starts in our families. It starts with like being a little bit more politicized and having conversations around the dinner table about a variety of things. Because our queerness is not, it's not just about who we're attracted to. For me, queerness it runs much deeper. It's about social justice. So when we have a family dinner and we ordered way too much food or we made way too much food, maybe it's good, it'll last for the week, but I would love to have a conversation about where our sense of scarcity comes from and what is our engagement with class. Like, are we still telling the story of who we were 30 years ago versus who we are now? um you know if we talk about the news, I would love for us to talk about how we participate in anti-Black racism, um and how we have progressed in this world on the backs of other people. So this doesn't sound utopic, right? I'm talking about depressing things, but what I'm saying is the opportunity to be able to talk and have intergenerational dialogue is a utopia, and being able to then be who you want to be without the guilt, without all the strings would be nice. I think one thing that we're all grieving intergenerationally is the idea of cultural preservation. I think part of why I was so involved in my own Muslim community as a younger person was because I thought it was my duty to carry on a tradition. And I remember as a young person, like maybe 14, 15, 16, really thinking, hey, all these other people are not asking theological questions. They're not getting involved in the community. What's going to happen to us? you know, that's an anxiety that like I hope other people don't have to carry. It's too much of a responsibility. And like the truth is, it'll morph into something else. Maybe it'll change. Maybe we'll lose it. Maybe we'll create something else. But trying to preserve an idea at the expense of other people is also not it's also not a way to live a life. It's not a utopia, right? And so yeah, I'm just putting that out there, like I see somebody has in the chat said like maybe it'll become more inclusive, and it's true. But when I think about a utopia, I'm also thinking about a queer politic, right? So if I had a partner, I mean, I did have a partner for many years, and then we're no longer together. But at the time, it's not like our family invited us over for brunch every Sunday. But let's say they did. I don't know if I would want to do that either. There's something about wanting to be seen with the same respect and given the same opportunities as my heterosexual counterparts. But there's also a politic about me that says, I want to resist this. I don't want my life to look exactly like that. And so that troubles the idea of what a utopia is. And makes me sound incredibly difficult as a human. Not complex, but difficult. Because there's a kind of angst where I'm just not quite happy. And to me, that's about not knowing where my place is and always figuring it out, and fear of complacency, right? So anyway, I'll leave it there because I've rambled a bit, but thank you for that.
No, Rahim, that was that was absolutely beautiful, and so much of what you said just resonated so deeply. This kind of honesty and clarity of questioning. Um, it's really hard, and but to kind of address this, I want to be very straightforward about utopia in my very narrow little world, in my very narrow little context, is really about every child having the opportunity, the freedom to define who they are in all aspects of their life. And exactly what you said, not just their who they're attracted to or what their internal sense of gender is, but just the freedom to define who they are.
Yeah.
And very importantly, this freedom should come not at the cost of losing family and community. So if the child moves with the family and community, that would be genuinely utopia, because this child is genuinely supported, is loved, and is able to be who they really want to be in all
Yeah.
aspects. And regardless of what they want to do with their career or their relationships or whatever it is, they still are supported. So, and
Mhm.
I see that happening. I mean, I'm very excited about the changes that are taking place. And when I say our community, I'm thinking of the South Asian community, right?
Yeah.
So I see a lot of real important changes taking place, and I think people have fought for it, of course, and that's why
Yeah.
it's happening. Where all the fitting into the whole heterosexual kind of pattern, right? So people are now are going into spaces and getting married. I mean, the gay marriages are a big thing. Even Bollywood is getting on that bandwagon,
Mhm.
but that's happening, and people can choose to do that if they want to, and if they want to throw away all their money, that's another issue. But it's a possibility, and I think so. What I would like to see, and I keep coming back, and I think you also keep coming back to this idea of religious spaces, of spaces which have been like kind of treasured and valued, particularly amongst immigrant communities, because they just foster this deep sense of home, of belonging, right? And these are the spaces that queer and trans people find themselves estranged from.
Mhm.
And so I want those spaces to really be open. I mean, I live in New Jersey, where there's during like fall, some of the parking lots in my neighborhood are transformed into outdoor garba, stages. Essentially, like the whole community shows up. Sometimes you're wearing winter coats. Sometimes it's really hot in October and November, and you show up just as. But I would love to see people in drag, gender diverse people, trans folk showing up just the way that they want to show up. I would love to see
Mhm.
all of these people being welcomed as dancers and being part of a sacred space and a social space. I would love to see gurdwaras and mosques sort of not have gender segregation. That's another issue, but not
Mhm.
segregation in any way. Sit where you want, be who you want.
Mhm.
So those are the kinds of ways I think that we can actually aspire to our community beginning to resemble a genuinely beautiful place.
Mhm.
And lastly, I would love to see, I think you touched a little bit upon this, I'd like to see beauty recognized,
Mhm.
because I think one of the things I've noticed, and in my own, you know prior to my kind of unlearning and relearning, I didn't see beauty in gender diversity. I saw, like,
Mhm.
gender diversity is sort of like a little bit like out of the norm, and it's like, okay, so I
Mhm.
need to see this now. But it's sort of almost like a revelation. Your eyes open to beauty, and you see
Yeah.
this beauty in people and who they are, and I think that really is utopian. And if
Mm.
that everybody's eyes can be opened, I think that would really be my dream come true.
Aruna, as you're talking, I was just thinking the tensions. So when we think about the work we have to do in our community, like dismantling or challenging the idea about marriage as the norm or as the goal of life, challenging gender roles in our families, thinking about masculinity and what it means to be a man, all of those things are important. Um, but then, when we try to teach white people what cultural competency is, sometimes we end up telling them, hey, don't be too harsh on us because we've got some very specific gender roles that are part of our culture, and there's a tension there because we further entrench who we are in a fixed way when we try to teach other people about our culture, when really right now we're having a conversation about shifts in our culture and work that needs to be done.
Mhm.
Thank you. Again, the idea of freedom just keeps coming up for me,
Mhm.
and the self-definition in a safe environment.
Mhm.
Um, and then the beauty that Aruna mentioned. I mean, I personally have had to go through that process as well, as someone who at one point identified as this and had some self-hate around that as well. And
Mhm.
that own journey around acknowledging what aesthetic can look like and how it also can be mirrored internally, is a journey for many folks. And before we go on to the Q&A session, which I really encourage everyone, drop in your questions. We'll have one closing question where you could also add in, if you have any other closing thoughts, feel free to add that in now, or we can add that in after the Q&A. So in closing, what currently do you see within our cultures and communities that we can keep building on or emphasizing more to achieve more of this utopia? And yeah, let's go with that. And if you want to add in anything else, please just add it in.
For me, I think it's one very specific thing, and that is disrupting the idea that privacy is more important than freedom. I think I believe in privacy. I think privacy is important. I think in our communities, we overvalue we overemphasize privacy, to the exclusion of seeking support or talking about what we're experiencing. And the more you talk about your thoughts and your feelings, like you develop a skill to be able to do that, right? So you move from a place of being able to say, like, I'm not just upset, or you can't be this, or you can't do that, but more like, I didn't expect this. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling grief, or I feel worried for you. Like, I love a good feeling word or a series of them, and I think that's what we need to work on.
Absolutely. I hear you there in terms of like learning, learning the language to say what you need to say is just been really important for me. I'm thinking of a couple of things that I think are really happening right now that can be used to sort of, build on. And one is this, the queer and trans concept of chosen family, which really is not just the queer and trans
Mhm.
communities, version of things, because, immigrants have been building chosen family, right? I mean, we come to this
Mhm.
country and sort of decide that we have to leave all these networks behind and we build our chosen family. And what I see happening, at least within the networks that I am part of, is intergenerational chosen family being built, where people who have not been able to have birth families or biological families that are accepting and celebrate their world, to having like other people in the community who are stepping
Mhm.
forward, to show up at, you can rent a mom, you can have somebody show up at your event, as in lieu of like perhaps the mom who won't be there. And so those are the kinds of things I see as very positive, very affirming, very loving. And I
Mhm.
think it builds on our strengths as an immigrant group that wants kind of like everything gets translated into kinship, right?
Mhm.
And so this is kinship that we are expanding. And I find that really beautiful when I see that in action, particularly when I see younger folks and kind of, hanging out with people, my age or older, and just having this sort of like family being built. And the other thing that I keep coming back to is I think this has really happened, at least within the last few years, where there's so much more visibility of queer and trans folks in our community. So I see all these brown people now who are stepping forward and really becoming possibility models. And that came out of this term that Laverne Cox used, where she said that, I don't want to be anybody's role model. I want to be a possibility model, because
Mhm.
then you see somebody who you don't necessarily want to aspire to be, but someone who shows you that it's possible. And I'm very encouraged by that. I really am like so thrilled to see all these people, stepping forward and showing this next generation of kids what's possible.
Perfect. And I think on my own plug, I'm going to add in the possibility model. I think a lot of us of South Asian origin also have histories of gender diversity and sexual identity diversity from pre-colonial times. And I know we discussed a bit of how, sometimes folks may romanticize that, and that's not the angle I'm getting at. The idea that we've always existed, I think, is important. And when there are roots, if we do have to dig for it, because our history is either erased or shut down, as well as a lot of different other minority histories. But at what point, what role do they play in society? What connections do we have to that identity that we can be reminded of, okay, I have not been alone and I won't be alone. There will be ways to keep bringing that history back in the present. So that's another thing that especially folks who do not identify within the LGBTQ space can take upon in doing that research and bringing that to light more and more as stronger allies. So now, let us go to our Q&A. Thank you to those who have submitted some questions. And the first one we have is for both panelists. So this person wanted to ask whether shows like Schitt's Creek, I believe that's how you pronounce it, okay, that normalize queer gender identity have contributed to the scenario being a little better than the 80s and 90s. What are ways to help make LGBTQ and TGNC individuals feel more included, welcome, and comfortable with openly sharing their identity. And they shared an example actually where one of their LGBTQ friends who is Gujarati came out to his parents and to the public after Schitt's Creek and quoted the line from the show, they're into the wine and not the label, which was an excellent line. And if someone could dig up maybe just that episode, that'd be great so everyone has context, but it's a very good
I mean, I
comparison.
love that show. Aruna, do you want to?
No, go ahead, Rahima. I
Okay.
actually I've only heard about it via my kid. I haven't actually watched it.
Oh, okay. I've watched all the seasons, so and it's a Canadian show, so I really do love it. I think media representation of queer people and trans people is very important. And what I like about Schitt's Creek, as an example, is that we're talking about a femme guy who, you know, I like it when a femme guy is like, oh, I don't care about the label, right? Usually, if you have somebody that's more conforms to gender ideals or gender norms, if they're like, I don't care about the label, the first thing I think about is, oh, internalized shame, right? But when a femme guy's like, oh, who cares about this label? I'm thinking about possibility and about fluidity and the richness that comes with that. That show's also very white. And I think when I think about where a lot of our community consumes media, it's things like WhatsApp, or the University of WhatsApp, as it's sometimes called. They also consume media from like certain newspapers over others. And forgive me if this is an overgeneralization, but I think folks in our world, they still really like email forwards. So like that's still a thing. And so when I think about where our stories need to be and where our representation needs to be, it's in some of those places, as well as in Bollywood, you know. And it's not enough to, you know, just to be represented in a small way or to be alluded to, but like, what does good representation look like? And yes, the representation helps us. It helps open our minds. It helps normalize things. But in my utopia, like, I'm not just normalized, and that's why people accept me. Like, people have built a skill around critical thinking and challenging systems. Because as soon as they accept me, their mind will have done some kind of adjustment that makes me okay, but leaves somebody else out. So there's a skill that needs to be acquired.
Yeah, no,
I
I,
love
I
that.
totally. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I hear you about the whole media representation thing, and one thing I wanted to say was one thing that people have constantly forwarded to me, possibly because I'm a parent, is
Mhm.
this WhatsApp video that made the rounds for a couple of years actually about this woman called I'm blanking on her last name. I think her first name was Gauri. She's a trans woman in India who adopted a child who she found. She was formerly a sex worker and now is this, I think, like a public health educator. And so she came across this child of a sex worker and adopted the child. And now the child is grown, or at least like, you know, in sort of school, college, something like that. So this is kind of like this sort of, you know, sort of very like heart-wrenching story, and also very like sort of, you know, all about like maternal feelings and things like that. It was like this kind of sentimental Tamil movie that, you know, you could have watched anywhere, but it was encapsulated in a little short with a WhatsApp video. And so many people, countless people from like my family to friends, all sent it to me. So I think that kind of thing has an impact. I mean, obviously there's problems. I mean, you know, this woman is like essentially like a saint. So the assumption is, of course, all trans people now need to be saints. So, but I think that kind of thing really has an impact on the community. Bollywood maybe, but really, I think these kinds of like short little, you know, theme videos really have an impact. And WhatsApp, I think somebody said, is like QAnon. Yes, indeed. My family WhatsApps are toxic, and it's awful. I mean, you can't really read half of this stuff. So, but I think we need to kind of like inject some good content in there.
Mhm. And teach, like we need to like to do more work to teach each other how to be better consumers of information. Um, that's I mean, maybe that's another conversation. So I'm happy to take another question from the audience. Faizan?
No, I think I'm hearing critical thinking and being a little more self-aware, reflective, how we engage and what we
Yes.
consume and what we share.
Hmm.
So yes, our other question, we have two more, and I want to be sure to get to both of them.
Okay.
Time heads up. First is, I'd be curious how this applies to the institution of marriage. In my conversations with queer colleagues and friends, sometimes they have shared frustration about gay marriage being a marker of equality, given that it is rooted in a heterosexual construct. But then they're also plagued because marriage allows certain protections for a spouse. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we think about anti-oppressive practice and observe our own social justice lens.
Do you want me to take a jab at this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, there's this great book that was published by AK Press. It's like an anarchist press. It's called Against Equality. And they talk a lot about this, you know, like what the heck is this? Like we've all just settled that marriage is a thing that we want. And I think on the one hand, gay marriage is important in that it, you know, it recognizes us in a dominant sphere. So we're not relegated to the margins. I think it's important to be represented in media, marketing, policies, politics, all of that. But I think the question that comes up is who of the queer people is being most represented when marriage is being pushed forward as the issue, right? When I think about, you know, in Toronto, where I'm from, of all the homeless youth, 40 to 50% are LGBTQ identified, right? And there's been a number of studies that have shown trans people are chronically overeducated and underemployed and making something like $30,000 to $40,000 a year, if not less, which is not a living wage. So when I think about the people who are at the margins within the LGBTQ community, I don't think marriage is the first thing that's on their mind. I think some of them are thinking about like accessible, gender affirming procedures and surgeries. They're thinking about housing. They're thinking about being able to find work as a queer or trans person or a person who is transitioning, you know? I think there's a lot of other things that come to mind. Now, I think one thing we have to settle with is that there's always going to be a critique, right? So sure, you know, something needs to get pushed forward, fine. But let's not try to say that that's so good that we can't critique it. We should always be able to critique everything because the voices that get heard will always be with people who have a little bit more power, right? And so somebody will invariably get left behind, and we need to name that, right? So marriage is great. I'm glad people are doing it. There's more to our people in our community and our needs and our disparities than not being included in marriage legislation.
Yeah, I just want to be very realistic that in this context, a queer and trans person's view is the polar opposite of the family's view. So the parents are obsessed with marriage as the beginning and end of everything. And this is obviously true for cis straight people, queer trans people, anybody. So what I find, and again, I don't know whether to be like pleased by this or perhaps like concerned, is that increasingly in our parent networks, parents are showing up saying, okay, so I've accepted that my kid is whatever, LGBTQ spectrum they're on.
Mhm.
But I also want them to find a good match. And do you know of people who would fit into this category and my kid could meet? How does my kid meet people if they're queer or trans?
We have to ask Seema Auntie from the show.
Right, there you go. So I think this is very much something that families are thinking about, and they're just kind of transferring this idea of, okay, so I have a cis straight child, now I have a queer trans child. But either way, this marriage thing is really fundamental and important because it's about safety. And it means that my child will be like, part of some social fabric when I'm gone, or I'm assuming that's the thought. And I did want to also throw in this thing about adoption, which is again also in the news right now, where organizations that previously were felt free to discriminate against queer couples are now opening up adoption, which could be a real game changer, for many people to build their families if they so choose to.
You know what's tricky about some of this, Aruna, is that fundamentally, when I think about our communities, how can I feel as a gay person, as a queer person, accepted in them if those very people haven't challenged the idea that they are worth more than their ability to get married, right? Like, like that can't be the only marker to assess your worth in the world. And if it is, you're gonna like, they're gonna disappoint me, right? They're not creating a world that's for me, really.
Absolutely. We need to look to the aunties coming up after us for this.
Mm.
I love where this conversation also turned into, because it's now about whose validation are we seeking and why, and where did that framework come from, and how much power does that have over us? Why? There's so many whys we avoid. Don't ask these questions because the why answer can be very scary, and it will unsettle a lot of your comfortable bubble. And
Yes.
I think that's part of the queering politic of we do poke bubbles and holes in all of these bubbles, because there's no other way to survive and move through to become that thriving individual we wish to. So we create our own space there. And I, again, love this conversation. We have one more question from the audience that I'd love to ask. And we can start with Rahim, perhaps again on this, or Erna, actually, whichever. I'm going to present it and you see how you feel.
Sure.
So do you have advice on how to deal with grief or anticipated grief for queer desis who are in the coming out process? So perhaps from both angles, as a queer desi, as well as someone supporting a queer desi, we would love to hear that. So maybe Erna, you could start us off.
Sure. Yeah, no, I do encounter a lot of grief. And it's usually, it's just the sense of like having to lose something to be your authentic self. And perhaps actually, I don't know, perhaps it's the way that many people have to encounter things, but I think particularly for queer trans people, it's just this kind of, you're just placed into this polar opposite situation where either you can choose to be always deny yourself and then have all the other things that you value, or you can choose to be who you are and then lose many of these things. And I think people do lose families, and it's heart-wrenching for them. I hear all the time from people who have lost families, either in terms of like, actively, like there is, like a schism and then that's it, your family's gone, or there is a slow petering out of any relationship that they've ever had. So I think this is something that people have to encounter. And again, I go back to this idea of chosen family, and making chosen family more than just building a queer trans community, which is very vibrant and which is so fulfilling. But look beyond that into the rest of the community and build your chosen family there. I think that's really one way to handle this. And also to kind of step away from this idea of responsibility for where your family is at. Because I think that's the biggest thing. It's like, if only I do this, then they'll come around. If only I do one more thing, or if I give them time, or whatever it is,
Get
it's not
another
your,
degree.
yes, there you go. Yeah. So it's not your responsibility. That's all I would say. Like, so essentially to kind of like shed that sense of responsibility for bringing other people to where they need to be.
Mm.
I'm going to add in a bit there also, I think, on the sense of legitimacy. And I think in my own case, that other degree was a piece of legitimacy I needed to complete the level of acceptance that I needed in so many parts of my world, just to feel safer or more free, because now I'm allowed to be that because I've conformed in this way. Tying into this white supremacist model as well of, accumulation. So there's a lot of tension there. But yes, Raheem.
But I agree with that. Like I can, in a conversation about queerness and me being normal and my people's rights and all kinds of things, I get to leverage education because that's a thing people around me in my community, they recognize, right? So I'm like, hey, I'm an expert in this. You have to hear what I'm saying. I mean, they would rather hear something that's nonsense on WhatsApp, but I'm gonna let that go. Coming back to this question of grief, which is our last question, I think I have to say two things. One is grief is a response to loss, right? So acknowledge very explicitly, what is it that I've lost? Is it a person? Is it an idea? Is it a concept? Is it a relationship? And then have some self-compassion for yourself for having wanted that, right? And think about how it might have been important for that loss to take place for you to be able to grow, right? Lots of people leave toxic relationships and feel incredibly lonely and lose a lot of support. But emotionally, they'll say, you know, I'm in a better place. And that might be hard to, it might sound convoluted, but I think we need to have self-compassion and to really praise ourselves for the skills and the bravery it takes to endure the loss when we know it's coming, when we anticipate it. The other thing I say about grief, because your question was about dealing with it, is that in my work, I found that, you know, while we can give people skills and create insight around triggers, management, and care around anxiety and depression. You know, we're like, what situation activates your anxiety? What skills can you employ to reduce that anxiety? Grief, in my experience, is very amorphous and kind of unexpected. You know, it just shows up. These moments where you feel slightly dislocated, where you're like, I'm doing something, I'm out with people, or I'm taking a walk alone, or I'm watching a show, and something hits me where I'm suddenly feeling a deep sadness about who I am, or where I belong, or what I've lost. And all you can do is sit with it. You know, I had a friend who was like, my medication isn't working, I'm still feeling so sad. And I said, yes, darling, we're all on the same medication. I'm glad those have been invented, but being on your SSRI doesn't mean you're not supposed to feel or that you're doing something wrong. There's a skills deficit because you're feeling the pain. That, my friend, that feeling is to be alive, and we have to endure it. That's part of it. That's part of the work.
Can I just applaud after that? Please. I just love what you say, Rahim. It just hits me like, you know, so in the heart, and just beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Thank you, Arunanti.
Honestly, thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes left, and what I'll do is just summarize a little bit about what I feel like I've been on a little journey here. It's a good way to spend my Saturday afternoon, honestly. And then I'll pass it on to Aruna and Rahim if you have any closing comments or any thoughts for the audience. So we started off in talking a bit about this like immigrant time warp and a lot of trauma, and the theme of loss and grief started here, and a lot of the fear. And we've even brought in the concept of assimilation as a survival tactic, even for some of us to be seen. And that was rooted in the beginning. We talked more about how we're having a crisis of imagination in our community, and what are we envisioning as freedom? Whose freedom are we living out? Whose script are we leading? Are we rewriting it in a way that feels more wholesome than the last generation? And is the last generation allowing for that? What do we see as desirable? We've talked a bit about how our worth is very much tied to why we've migrated here, and can we create more models of success for ourselves? Peer support was brought up by Erna, especially, as something that's really helpful for family units and parents to find some solace and colleagues in working through grief, as well as the chosen family concept that really comes down from our histories for queer and trans folk, as well as the South Asian diaspora communities. We talked about utopia, our excitement of wanting to be seen as our whole selves and how we can raise our children to self-define. Can we enable that? How do we enable that? Have we enabled ourselves to do that so that we feel prepared to allow for this environment? And everyone's sense of belonging and freedom can seem different. So even that imposition of not wanting to have Sunday brunches every week, you know, that's okay even. And yet, how do I create my own model and be accepted by that and not have to be defensive about it? And then we moved on to, okay, what do we have already in our community? A lot of that was this chosen family idea, culture as a mode of connection. And we have established spaces. Now, how do we expand the thought around them and our history of gender diversity and sexuality as well, right? We didn't just pop up, we've been around. And so that even the argument coming from parents and say, give us time to get used to this. Well, when did you ignore us in the past in your life? Can we talk about that? Those hard questions. And a few questions, a lot of us here may be practitioners as well, or we ourselves might be, we all have lives where we interact with others, thinking about whose concept of freedom are we living out? What are you pushing on not only yourselves and your families, but your clients? And when we see those that refuse therapy, to refuse their own healing, it's also refusing to support the healing of others in ways, and thinking about the validation. So I'm gonna stop there with the summary and pass it on to Rahim or Aruna if you'd like to add anything else before we close out.
I can't imagine what I would say. I'm actually I'm pretty tired. But this is a great conversation. I really like, this intergenerational dialogue. It does, I'm presenting here at a conference, which typically when you present at a conference, you're sharing your work, or you're sharing something you've done or created. But I think what we've done here is we've created a space to get our needs met, as service providers, as people who do work in the community. So I'm just appreciative of this.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I mean, this has just been an amazing dialogue, and I cannot thank Rahim and Fizan enough for this, because I think you two are just such amazing foils for this auntie, and I hope to have many more conversations like this with both of you.
Well, thank you, everyone. If there's anyone, we have 3 minutes. If you all want to say anything, chat. I mean, it's pretty intimate. Feel free. Otherwise, thank you for coming. And Preet, if there's anything to add to on your end.
No, just want to thank everyone for being here. We still have 2 minutes if anyone has any reflections they want to share. All right.
I would actually, one thing I forgot, I would actually like to ask those of you who are providers here, if you would like to be listed on on essentially a community source list that we are trying to generate, because one of the big questions we get asked is, refer me to a therapist, and we're like, where are we going to find this therapist? But if you'd like to be part of this referral list, you can actually, let me see if I can just pull the link up, but otherwise you can certainly email me, and we'd love to have more providers who are affirming, really be part of our referral listing, and anywhere in this country or in Canada, because we get requests from all over.
Well, thank you to our panelists for today. And thank you all of you for being here. The next talks are going to start shortly, so I hope that all of you can join for the other sessions. Thank you.